This recording is protected by copyright. No part may be reproduced without the prior permission of the University of South Australia.
where we have the representation of the flow of that in an actual activity diagram. Okay, so it's the flow of activities that is moved onto the activity diagram. My apologies, externals, I've just turned on my microphone. Hopefully you could still hear me for the first 5 minutes, but I'm just going through the overview of what we're covering today, so apologies for that. So yes, then we'll look at activity diagrams based on the flow of activities, which is represented in the extended use case description. So as was mentioned in the audience, I'm going to play this video that is also on the course website. Rather than, I'm sure you can all quite easily read the slides I've got. I think it's a really useful description coming from the authors of the textbook that gives you context of what we mean by use case description. So I'll play that video now. So you can get an understanding of what we mean by use case descriptions.
After identifying use cases, it's important to write use case descriptions that give more detail about the processing that goes on for the use case. We saw previously that you can write brief use case descriptions for all of the use cases initially after identifying them.
This is one of the parts that you have to do in your assignment. Okay, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm sure you have to identify the use cases as well as provide brief use case description. So it's important for you to understand and recognise what we mean by a use case, a brief use case description, and a fully developed use case description.
For example, here we have create customer account as a use case, and the brief description just simply is a list of steps written out usually as one sentence, such as user actor enters new customer account data, the system assigns account number, creates a customer record, and creates an account record. Now, for many use cases, that might be enough of a description. In other cases, you need a lot more detail when processing gets complicated. A fully developed use case description is written when you need to document a lot more information about a use case than a simple brief use case description would provide. There's a traditional format used for use case descriptions, as shown here is just one example. It's usually strictly text rather than a diagram, and there are 11 different sections that provide important information about each use case. The sections are use case name, what scenario of the use case, the triggering event, brief description, actor or actors involved in the use case, related use cases, stakeholders, preconditions, postconditions, flow of activities, often called flow of events, and then exception conditions that might occur. Now let's look at the top part of the use case description in a little more detail. First of all, we have the use case name, create customer account is the example we're doing here. And again, we've named this use case from the beginning. We talked about it a moment ago as a brief use case description alone. And of course, it's named verb now. Now there can be one or more scenarios for each use case. In this case, the scenario is create online customer account. So this description applies to the processing required when a customer creates their own account online. We can indicate the triggering event. If you use the event decomposition technique for identifying use cases, you'd already know what the event is, and you would simply write it here. In this case, it's new customer wants to set up account online. If you haven't used the event decomposition technique, instead using the user goal technique, this might be a good time to go back and say, okay, what exactly does happen that causes this use case to need to be executed? The brief description we've already written is filled in here. And then the actor or actors involved. Now this would be the type of actor. In this case, it's a customer. Many use cases have more than one types of actor. Related use cases would be use cases that either are invoked by this use case or that cause this use case to be invoked. In this particular case, creating a customer account might be invoked when the checkout shopping cart use case executes. Stakeholders would be any individuals or groups that have an interest in how this use case is going to turn out. These would be people you'd want to be sure to interview to make sure you captured all the necessary detail from their point of view. Accounting, marketing, and sales are all interested in this use case. And then we have preconditions and postconditions. Preconditions are those conditions that have to be true before this use case can begin to execute. In this particular situation, the customer account subsystem must be available to run on the current processor. And the credit debit authorization services must be available. This would typically be an external service that would verify when customer account information about their credit card or debit card is entered. And then postconditions indicate what has to be true to be able to say that the use case executed successfully. All of these conditions must be met to say we're now complete, the use case is now complete. First of all, a customer has to be created and saved. One or more addresses must be created and saved. If you recall from the domain model, each customer can have more than one address. The credit debit card information must be successfully validated by the external service. An account instance must be created and saved. And then finally, the address and account must be associated with that new customer.
Just want to go through some of these fields with you. We've got here create online customer account as a scenario for this particular use case. Can anyone think of another scenario where we might create a different use case description or fully use case description for create customer account? So in this case we have a create online customer account as one scenario. Create in-store customer account. Okay? How else might we create a customer account?
Maybe you might have like a supplier, you might have the account for them.
Yeah, it's still creating a customer account though. It's just a different type of customer. Okay? Or you may have a different use case that's called create supplier account. Okay, so that's probably more a different use case as opposed to a different scenario for this particular use case.
Phone service or
Phone, yep. So if someone rings up and wants to create a customer account, that's another scenario. So for every use case that we have in our use case diagram, you need to create at least one fully developed use case description. Okay? But for every use case, there may be multiple scenarios that we can create different use case descriptions for, because the way you create a customer online in terms of the preconditions and the postconditions or the flow of activities, which we'll look at in the next screen, the way you do that might be different. So if there's a different business process involved in the way you need to handle a particular use case, then you need to have a different use case description or create a specific scenario so that when the system is actually designed and developed, that the developers know that, okay, create customer is different depending on how we create a customer. Does that make sense? Okay, so for every use case in a use case diagram, we need to develop a fully developed use case description. In some cases, there may be different business processes involved for a particular use case. In that scenario, or in that situation, we create different scenarios. So the developers know how to actually write the software and write the system to handle the creation of that particular scenario. All right? There may not necessarily be related use cases. Okay, every use case is not always invoked by something or doesn't invoke another use case. So don't assume that you have to fill out every single field in this particular fully developed use case description. The stakeholders may not necessarily always be the people that are directly interacting with the system. Okay? The actors are the ones that are shown on your use case diagram because it shows the actor and the interaction with the actual use cases. The stakeholders may not necessarily appear on that use case diagram, but they have an interest somehow to do with that particular use case, which is why they are represented as a stakeholder. And as was mentioned in the video, the brief description, you should be able to get that brief description from the previous slide where it had the use case and the brief use case description. So if you've already done that, then you shouldn't have to duplicate your effort. Okay, so some of these pieces of information you should be able to gather from your previous modelling that you've done with your use case diagram. Okay, let's move on.
Now, what you can do when thinking about preconditions and postconditions, these are important considerations when you're writing test cases in order to test this use case. So this can be very, very valuable, not only for indicating what processing has to occur for the people who design this use case, but also setting up the tests. For example, if you're going to be doing a test, you have to test to make sure that the system can handle it when the customer account subsystem is not available and someone requests to create a customer account. You have to figure in how to handle the situation if the credit debit authorization services are not available when we're attempting to create a customer account. And then the post conditions would be things you'd need to check to make sure that you had tested successfully. So you literally would need to go into the database and check to see, is that new customer record created and saved in the database? Is there an address? Is there an account? Has the credit debit card information been validated? And then are the address and account correctly associated with the customer? So this is a lot of important information. The final thing to note for preconditions and postconditions is in the use case description itself, we're specifically identifying domain classes that are important in this use case. Domain classes that we're going to need to read information about, domain classes we're going to have to update information about, domain classes we're going to need to create. Now let's look at the bottom part of the use case description. And here we have the flow of activities and exception conditions. The flow of activities is usually done in a two-column format where we have the actor on the left and the system on the right. The two-column format allows us to define what's really a dialogue between the actor and the system. The actor does something, the system does something. Then the actor does something, then the system does something in response. The steps under each actor and system are numbered. So the actor here is doing step 1, 2, and 3. And then similarly, on the system side, we have 1.1, 1.2 in response to step 1, and 2.1, 2.2 in response to step 2, and 3.1, 3.2, 3.3, 3.4 in terms of the system. And when you talk about dialogue design as part of the beginnings of user interface design, this is really what we mean by a dialogue. Let's just walk through it real carefully here. Customer indicates a desire to create a customer account and enters basic customer information. The system creates a new customer, and the system prompts for customer addresses. Number 2, customer enters one or more addresses. The system creates the addresses, system prompts for credit debit card. Customer enters debit credit card information, system creates the account, system verifies authorization for credit debit card, system associates customer address and account together, and system returns valid customer account details back for verification to the actor. So that's the flow of activities, again sometimes called flow of events. Exception conditions here relate to steps specifically in the flow of activities. So an exception condition is kept separate from the basic flow. The first exception condition, 1.1, means it's linked back to step 1.1. System creates a new customer. The exception condition could be basic customer data are incomplete. And so now something has to be done to get the information complete. And 2.1 keys back to step 2.1 above here. System creates the addresses, and the address isn't valid. And then 3.2 links back to step 3.2 on the system side. System verifies authorization for credit debit card, and this would be the exception. The credit debit information isn't valid. So that's the basic idea with the use case description, the fully developed use case description. Quite a bit of information here. Some designers can take this information and go ahead and design a pretty nice use case. In other cases, you might want to do a little additional modeling. And we'll talk about some of those additional models next.
All right. So in summary, we've got our use case descriptions where we write a brief use case description as we talked about in Chapter 3. So for each of the use cases that you've identified in your use case diagram, you need to be able to present or provide a brief use case description, which pretty much identifies who the actor is, or what they are doing, and what basically kind of happens as a result of their action. Okay, how does the system respond? Okay, so we can see here the user actor enters customer account number and the system retrieves and displays customer and account data. The user or the actor enters order number and the system retrieves, the actor enters, the system does. So it's flicking backwards and forwards in terms of saying what the user does and what the actor does. This can also help you when you are representing the flow of activities in the extended use case description, and it basically helps you with your thinking in terms of, have I got the steps right in terms of what's going on? So remember, this is a brief use case description which you can use in the brief use case description field in the extended use case description. So again, just really listing what was covered in the video that we just watched. So when you have to write a fully use case description or a fully developed use case description, you do it for the more complex use cases. Sometimes you only really need to go by the brief use case description. That might be sufficient for progressing with your scenario. You may not necessarily need to present or provide a fully developed use case description. So it's not compulsory to create every combination of every diagram for everything when we are modelling user requirements. Okay? It's largely dependent on the scenario and who the users are and who you are modelling those requirements for. Okay? So a brief use case description could be enough. If we have a more complex scenario, and this is when we write a fully developed use case description. And again, these are the fields that are typically represented in a fully developed use case description. Now, if you were given a sample like this or a question like this in the exam, where you have to create or write a fully developed use case description, I can't remember whether I've got it in the sample exam or not, but I'm just letting you know now. If I did ask you to do one of these, you would be given that template, so you don't have to remember what everything is that you need to fill out, because that's really not the purpose of use case descriptions and me testing your knowledge. It's me testing whether you know what to incorporate in those fields. So if you did have a question like that, you'd be given the blank template which you can write in your own book. Okay? So that's just one comment I wanted to make. And this is pretty much the exactly same scenario that was presented in the video, and you can see that these fields here are duplicated in this particular scenario, which I'm not going to go through again because they already discussed it in the video. So you can see here we've got the first part, which has a bit of detail. I did mention, yes?
So in the exam, would it just be a completely blank?
So it would be the left-hand column would be shown. So it would give you the titles of what you need to fill out, but the right-hand part would not be filled out. Okay? So yeah, it wouldn't be completely blank with the lines and all that. I'd show you what the fields are that you need to fill out, and the two-column thing. So then you can transcribe that into your actual writing book. And probably I would suggest just use a whole A4 page or whatever, just draw it up and start filling in the rows as you go. Okay? So again, a bit more detail about what goes into each of these fields. For the use case name, again, we've got the verb noun phrase, which we've already talked about when we looked at use cases and how to write use case names. The scenario, as I said, may not necessarily have multiple scenarios for the one use case. Okay, so you may not necessarily have different scenarios. It might only be the one scenario. This is to represent more than one path if in the event it happens. The triggering event, again, is based on the event decomposition technique if you have followed that technique. Brief description, again, written previously when the use case was identified, and you should come up with a brief use case description for every use case. Why do you think it's important to come up with a brief use case description, and who would you show that to ensure that it's correct?
Because
The customer. Okay, so when gathering requirements, you need to determine what are the primary functional requirements of a particular system. That's going to help you come up with some use cases. We then have some use cases. You need to be able to interpret either through various pieces of documentation, through group interviews, through questionnaires, through surveys, through one-to-one interviews, try and elicit the information to determine what goes in each of those use cases that you've identified. The only way to do that is to start somewhere. So you have your use cases, you have a brief use case description, and you try and write down what you think is going on in each of those use cases. Then, or you may even do that in a conversation while you're having, a meeting with people or when you're in an interview. But it's really important to make sure and clarify that your interpretation is the same as what the customer expects to go on and to happen within that use case. So again, we've got our actors, one or more users from the use case diagram. The related use case doesn't necessarily have to be there if it doesn't have a related use case, if it doesn't invoke or include another use case. Again, the stakeholders, you don't get the stakeholders from your use case diagram. These are people or anyone with an interest in the use case, but not necessarily using the use case. Preconditions, what's going to be true before it begins. Postconditions, what has to be true once it's completed. The flow of activities, the activities that go on between the actor and the system, which again, we can take that flow of activities and represent it in an activity diagram, which we'll have a look at shortly. The exception conditions, what and where can go wrong. So it's pretty much your if. What happens if that normal scenario doesn't work, if there's a fail or a test that we need to consider. That's what you need to think about in your exception conditions. And there's not always going to be an exception condition for every single step. Okay, so don't think just because in that scenario there were 3 for each of the system steps, there may not necessarily be an exception condition for every single thing. But there may well be. So again, we have another example of a fully developed use case description. Okay, so when you're creating use case descriptions, another good thing to do is when you're modelling them is to label them. Okay? It's a fully developed use case description. Which use case are we representing? In this case, it's for ship items use case. The scenario is ship items for a new sale. And again, you can see the flow and how it all works. So just another example to help you with seeing the perspective and how things are done. In this case, again, you can see related use cases, none. Okay, so you don't have to have related use cases. We've got some preconditions of what must exist and some post-conditions. Here we've got some exception conditions. As I just previously said, note that number 4 does not have an exception condition. Okay? Whereas number 3, or 3.1, has 2 exception conditions. Okay, so there may be multiple or no exception conditions for some of these activities. I think that's all I want to say about that one. But you can, just to show you a bit of variety amongst use cases. Now, the basic process of writing use cases. So these are things that you need to think about when you are writing use cases. Obviously, the first thing you need to think about is the scope and the boundaries. You need to brainstorm a list of primary actors. Now, you would probably have some of these things done if you've already done your use case diagram. Okay? As I said, some of the fields that you need to fill out are based on what you've already developed with your use case diagram. So you brainstorm and list the primary actors that are going to be involved with a particular use case. Okay? List user goals. Capture the outermost summary use cases to see who really cares. So do you need to really do a use case diagram, a fully developed use case description for every use case? No, not necessarily. You may just have to do a brief use case description. reconsider and revise the summary use cases, select one use case to expand. Okay, so that's the basic writing process, figuring out which use cases you have, who your actors are, whether you need to extend any or all of those particular use cases. You've got to obviously capture the stakeholders and their interests, so who has an interest in this use case that's not necessarily an actor that's directly interacting with that particular use case. You write the main success scenario, okay, which is pretty much the flow of activities. You then need to think about and brainstorm and exhaustively list the extension conditions or the exception conditions. Okay, so it needs to think about all the things that the system can detect and that it must handle. So every single particular thing that can go right, but also every single thing that can potentially go wrong, okay, when you're developing a system. So it's pretty much checking that your data is complete, correct and true and that everything is there. We're assuming when we present the flow of activities that it's the normal everyday scenario. When we look at our extension handling or our extension conditions or exception conditions, okay, different authors call them different things. This is when we have our if this doesn't happen or if this goes wrong or if this doesn't exist, we need to handle that as an exception condition. So it's extra testing that you need to do. I guess it's kind of a validation way of thinking about it when you're validating your information. And then you need to do a couple of extra steps, extract complex flows to see if there's any other sub-use cases, which we haven't really covered and we're not going to cover. And write your use cases as necessary. A bit of also a bit of extra information. Now these slides I've actually extracted not from the textbook. These are from Alistair Cockburn, who's a prolific author in UML and writing use cases. So these are based on what he suggests. He's also given some pass-fail tests for the actual use case fields. So when you're looking at each of those fields, ask yourself pretty much these particular questions to help you filling out what goes on in the use case diagram or the fully developed use case description. He refers to an SUD, so I've just told you here what it means. SUD means the system under discussion or the system under design. So you need to be able to think about filling in the parts of the use case correctly. And by answering these simple tests, the answer should produce a yes answer. So the use case title, for example, is the name and active verb goal phrase the goal of the primary actor? Okay? Can the system deliver that goal? If the answer to those is yes, then the use case title is fine. One thing I also want to mention is that various authors present different, slightly different variations of the information that they give in their extended use case description, which is why you can see there's a couple of extra different things mentioned in here. In terms of so he talks about scope and level. Well, we don't have those fields, but we do have the primary active field. Okay, so the description, and that's why I'm going to give you the template if you do have it in the exam, or what I've got in the scenarios and what I expect in the assignment is the template that we've covered in class, okay, and in the lecture. So as I said, various authors have different ways of representing information. Another thing to mention is with the flow of activities in the video and in the book, they have the two-column flow of activities where you have your actor and your system. Some other authors or some other examples don't have two columns, they just have it as one long column, and they say the actor does this and the system does this and the actor does this and the system does this. So it's all the same kind of stuff, it's just a different way of representing the same information. Again, the way I want you to do it is the way that's presented in the textbook for your assignment and or your exam if the scenario presents itself. Okay? So yeah, don't be disheartened or confused by some of this, it's just different ways of representing things. So in terms of the primary actor, what are the kinds of questions you need to ask yourself? Does the name primary actor have behaviour? Does it have a goal against the SUD, the system under description? Preconditions, stakeholders and interests, the main success scenario, each step for any scenario. These are the questions you need to ask yourself. So as you're building this use case description, if you've been tasked with this question in your assignment, have a look at each of these pass-fail tests and look at each of these things. And if you can answer yes to a lot of those questions, or the majority of those questions, then you're well on your way to providing and presenting a really complete and succinct, fully developed use case description for that particular scenario that you are working on. So I found this a really useful extra resource to help you with how you go about writing one of these things. Whoops. And again, we've got extension conditions. Can and must the system detect it and handle it? Is it phrased as what the system actually detects? And a couple of extra things there. So basically has a lot of the fields that were given in the template I provided you, and some questions to ask yourself as you're filling out that information. Now, activity diagrams for use cases. Really short video, but basically gives you some context of how these fit into what we're doing.
The activity diagram can also be used to show the dialogue back and forth between the actor and the system. That's similar to the flow of activities from a use case description. So this is a UML activity diagram for the use case create customer account. The activity diagram has swim lanes, customer, and system. And the ovals inside here, of course, represent activities carried out by each swim lane. So the customer starts out by requesting account, and the system will create customer. And then the customer will enter addresses, and the system will create addresses. And then the customer will enter credit information, and the system will create the account. And then it'll verify the credit information, and then return account details.
What's missing in that diagram? The start, yes. Okay. How do we represent the start node? Circle, fully blacked out circle. Okay, so good to see that you've all taken something in from your first assignment. Okay, so an activity diagram is an activity diagram. Whether you're representing the flow of activities from an extended use case description, whether you're representing the flow of activities for making a chocolate cake or making a cup of tea, or representing a specific business process, okay? An activity diagram has got the same convention, it's got the same syntax. It's just showing you at which points in different ways we can use activity diagrams.
And then end state. So a system sequence diagram and an activity diagram and a use case description with a flow of activities shows this basic dialogue information about a use case. Remember, though, that an analyst is unlikely to create the use case description, the UML activity diagram, and the system sequence diagram for each use case. And they might only create one of these for any given use case and not the others. It's a matter of what the priority is for the analyst and what they're trying to uncover and discover and then model.
Which is exactly what I said. You don't have to create every combination of every diagram for every single situation. It is dependent on the situation, the scenario, the analyst, what the developers want, what the designers need, and what information you need to represent at a finer level of granularity, if you want to call it that. So again, this shows only the flow of activities between the customer and the system, and by looking at, or basically converting or looking back at the extended use case description and looking at the flow of activities, you can see that it's pretty much closely aligned with what's happening in the flow of activities. Note that we're not showing the exception conditions part, okay? It's only the main success scenario that we show when we convert our extended use case description into an activity diagram. So it's only the main success scenario, the main flow of activities, not the exception conditions. Here's another activity diagram for use case ship items. Again, you can see we have the decision diamond, we have our synchronization, Again, what's missing in here is your starting and your end, which I do want you to show. I do want you to represent every time you have it. Again, just another example of the way we have, in this case, we have two actors, the shipping clerk or clerk and the system, and what happens in this particular scenario. And this one relates back to the other activity diagram. So you've got two examples to have a look at in terms of activity diagrams, flow of activities, and how that main success scenario in your activity diagram, in your extended use case description, can be converted into an activity diagram. So you can see the interrelationship between the two. And that's it for today. I'll leave it at that. Unless anyone's got any specific questions, I'll see you next week, where we continue on with part 2 of use case modelling.